The chieftain's blood mixed with seawater on the deck as 23 of his own men stood frozen, forced to watch their leader systematically destroyed. The ropes creaked against wet wood. The only other sound was laboured breathing and waves lapping against the hull. This wasn't a battlefield. This was something far more calculated. Here was a man who'd led raids across the North Sea, who'd stood shield to shield with these very warriors now forced to witness his annihilation. But this wasn't about killing him. The Vikings had discovered something more devastating than death itself. They'd perfected a weapon that could destroy a man while leaving him breathing, a weapon that would send him home as a walking advertisement for Viking supremacy, not through his wounds, but through what they'd taken from him, his place in the world of men. The silence from his crew was absolute. They knew that any sound, any gesture of sympathy, could mark them as the next lesson. This was educational theatre at its most brutal, a carefully orchestrated destruction designed to teach everyone watching what happened when Vikings conquered. The chieftain would survive this. That was the point. He'd return to his village, to his family, to his hall, but he'd return as something less than dead, a ghost that breathed, a warning that walked. This calculated cruelty reveals the dark heart of Viking society, a world that had transformed male sexuality into a technology of absolute control. How did a warrior culture that celebrated divine gender bending create a legal system where men had to murder each other over sexual accusations? Why did the same society that honored Loki for birthing a horse execute farmers for wearing women's clothes? To understand this brutal paradox, we need to rewind 1,000 years to when the Norse gods themselves first drew the battle lines between divine privilege and human destruction. The drops of blood hit the stable floor as Loki's body convulsed, bones cracking and reshaping, his stallion form giving birth to an 8-legged foal that would become Odin's steed. This wasn't some shameful secret hidden in the margins of Norse mythology. This was a celebrated tale, told in mead halls, carved into wood, passed down through generations. Loki, the shapeshifter god, had transformed into a mare, mated with a stallion, and given birth. The ultimate violation of masculine boundaries, Schäfer, and it made him more powerful, not less. But here's the thing that would get any mortal man killed. While Loki earned praise for his reproductive transformation, a human man who even dressed in women's clothes faced execution. The gods didn't just break the rules, they shattered them, reconstructed them, played with gender, like children with clay, and the Vikings worshipped them for it. Odin himself, the All-Father, the god of war and death, practiced seether, women's magic. Picture this, the most masculine deity in the Norse pantheon, wearing women's robes, channeling feminine power, performing rituals that any mortal man would be murdered for attempting. The same act that made Loki divine would make you dead. There's Odin, seated on his throne in Asgard, bragging about his feminine magic. Below, in Midgard, a farmer accidentally lets his tunic hang too low, looking too much like a dress, and finds himself facing accusations that mandate combat or death. Thor, the thunder god, the ultimate warrior, once dressed as a bride, complete with wedding dress and veil, to retrieve his stolen hammer. The gods laughed. They celebrated his cleverness. They composed poems about it. A mortal man attempting the same disguise, he'd find himself bound and bleeding before sunset. And Odin wasn't done breaking the rules he enforced on others. The All-Father boasted of learning seither from the goddess Freya herself. He didn't hide this feminine practice. He advertised it. He used it to see the future, to understand fate, to gain power that masculine pursuits alone couldn't provide. The crossing of gender boundaries wasn't just acceptable for gods, it was a source of their strength. But wait, it gets more extreme. These same gods who freely crossed gender lines had given humans the very laws that made such crossing punishable by death. They'd handed down the social codes, the legal frameworks, the cultural expectations that trapped mortals in rigid masculine performances. The mythology reveals something crucial about Viking society. The gods represented everything mortals weren't allowed to be. They were the release valve, the fantasy, the impossible dream. Through divine stories, Vikings could explore forbidden territories, APT, but only vicariously, only through worship, never through action. This wasn't accidental. This was design. The gods modeled the acquisition of power through gender transgression, while simultaneously forbidding mortals from following their example. It created a system where masculine anxiety became worship, where men obsessed over boundaries they could never cross, powers they could never access. Listen to how the stories were told. When Loki gave birth, the focus wasn't on shame but on the magnificent eight-legged horse he produced. When Odin practiced women's magic, the emphasis was on the knowledge he gained. When Thor dressed as a bride, the tale celebrated his triumph in retrieving his hammer. But change the protagonist from god to human, and everything shifts. The same actions that demonstrated divine versatility proved mortal perversion. The same boundary crossing that showed godly power revealed human weakness. The double standard wasn't hypocrisy, CAS, it was hierarchy. Gods could transform, transcend, transgress because they were gods. Humans had to remain fixed, rigid, trapped because they were human. The divine examples didn't provide permission. They reinforced prohibition. Here's where it gets truly dark. The gods' freedom highlighted mortal imprisonment. Every story of Loki's transformations reminded human men of what they could never do. Every tale of Odin's magic emphasized what knowledge remained forbidden. Every joke about Thor in a dress underscored that mortals attempting the same would die. The Norse cosmos was built on this paradox. Worship beings who embody what you must never become. Celebrate divine actions that would destroy you. Honor gods for crossing lines that would mean your annihilation. But while gods wore dresses to gain power, mortal men who even looked at another man wrong-faced a legal system designed to guarantee only two outcomes: murder or death. The word hung in the air of the mead hall like a drawn blade. Arg. 3 seconds later, either the accuser or the accused would be dead on the floor. This wasn't metaphor. This was law. Viking legal codes had created the perfect trap. A single word that triggered mandatory violence. No trial, no investigation, no opportunity for defense. Just accusation and immediate bloodshed. Here's how the machine worked. Someone calls you argr, sexually passive, unmanly, penetrated. The law now requires you to challenge them to combat. Not allows. Requires. Refuse the challenge? You've legally confirmed the accusation. Accept your new status as less than a man, less than human. The accused man had exactly two legal options, and both involved death. Option 1. Fight your accuser. Win, and you've proven your masculinity through violence. Lose, and you die with your reputation technically intact. Option 2. Accept the accusation through inaction. Live, but as a social corpse, stripped of all legal rights, all human dignity. The genius of the system was its inevitability. Every accusation guaranteed violence, either immediate combat or the slow violence of social death. The law didn't seek truth, it manufactured bloodshed. Picture the scene. A crowded mead hall, old grudges simmering. Someone wants your land, your position, your wife. They don't need evidence. They don't need witnesses. They just need to speak one word loud enough for others to hear. Argr. No witnesses, no proof. Just one word that turned law into a loaded weapon. Now you're trapped. Refuse to fight, and you've proven the accusation true. Your property can be seized, your family shunned, your voice stripped of all legal weight. You become a non-person, breathing but socially dead. Fight and lose, you die. But your children keep their inheritance. Your wife keeps her status. Your name retains some honor. The law incentivized death over life. Better to die fighting a false accusation than live with its confirmation. But the real genius of the system was what happened if you survived. Win the combat, and what have you won? You've proven you can kill, not that you're innocent. The accusation lingers like smoke. People remember. They whisper. Maybe you won because you fought desperately, like someone with something to hide. The system created perfect paranoia. Every man became a potential accuser. Every gathering a potential trap. The law weaponized masculine anxiety, turned it into a social control mechanism that required no enforcement beyond human fear. Consider the premeditation required. Viking law carefully defined which insults triggered mandatory combat. Call a man a thief? Pay a fine. Call him a coward? Pay compensation. Call him sexually passive? Blood must flow. The hierarchy reveals what Viking society truly protected. Not property, not courage, but the fiction of impenetrable masculinity. The words themselves were precisely crafted. Argr meant passive. Sorðinn meant used sexually. Sorðinn meant penetrated. Each term designed to trigger the legal machinery of destruction. the vocabulary of violence masquerading as law. But here's what made it truly insidious. The accuser risked death too. Speak the word, and you must fight. This wasn't casual insult. This was mutual assured destruction. Yet the system persisted. Men continued to speak these words, trigger these combats, feed this machine. Why? Because the alternative was worse. In a society where masculine reputation determined everything, IS, property rights, legal standing, social existence, the risk of combat was preferable to the certainty of suspected femininity. Better to die maintaining the system than live questioning it. The law created its own ecosystem. Professional warriors could destroy enemies through accusation, knowing they'd likely win combat. Weaker men became targets, forced to fight battles they couldn't win or accept destructions they couldn't survive. And the spectators? They were part of the machine too. Witness an accusation without participating, and you might be next. The law required audience participation, collective enforcement. Everyone became complicit in the system that could destroy them. The trap was perfect because it was voluntary. No external force made men speak these words or answer these challenges. They policed themselves, destroyed each other, maintained their own imprisonment. The law simply provided the framework. Human fear did the rest. Here's the darkest part. The system worked exactly as designed, not to find truth or ensure justice, but to maintain brutal social control through terror. Every combat, whether won or lost, reinforced the message. Masculinity was performance, and any failure meant annihilation. The Vikings had created the perfect trap, but they weren't the first civilization to discover that the easiest way to control men was through their deepest fears about their own bodies. The ropes were arranged with surgical precision on the longship's deck, each knot placed to maximize visibility to the forced audience of the conquered crew. This wasn't random brutality. This was systematic. The Vikings had developed something more sophisticated than simple violence. They'd created a technology for destroying entire social structures through calculated sexual domination. The positioning mattered. The height of the platform ensured every watching warrior could see. The angle of restraint guaranteed maximum psychological impact. The timing, always in daylight, always with forced witnesses, transformed individual assault into collective trauma. This wasn't random brutality. It was a calculated science. Think about what conquest usually meant. Kill the leaders, take the resources, subjugate the population. But killing created martyrs. Dead chiefs became rallying cries for resistance. The Vikings had discovered something more effective, living ghosts who spread terror through their very existence. The selection process was precise. They didn't choose randomly. They targeted leaders, chieftains, successful raiders, respected warriors. Men whose masculinity was unquestioned, whose strength was proven. The higher the victim's status, the more devastating the demonstration. Here's how the system worked. Capture a rival warband. Instead of executing the leader, subject him to ritualized sexual assault before his men. Force them to watch their chief, the embodiment of masculine power, systematically unmanned, then release them all. The Vikings had discovered something more powerful than killing. Death ended suffering. Death could be honorable. Death created a clear ending. But this created something worse. Living weapons of psychological warfare. These men returned to their communities as walking proof of Viking dominance. The genius was in the aftermath. Send the broken chief home with his traumatized crew. They can't hide what happened. Too many witnesses. They can't lie. The synchronized trauma ensures consistent stories. They can't recover. The social machinery of their own culture now turns against them. Watch what happens next. The chief enters his own hall, and conversations stop. His warband, men who witnessed his destruction, can't meet his eyes. His voice, once commanding, now triggers communal memory of his subjugation. His very presence reminds everyone of their collective powerlessness. But the true horror began when they sent these men home. The ripple effects were calculated. The chief's wife faces an impossible choice: support her destroyed husband and share his shame, or abandon him and break sacred bonds. His children inherit not land and honor, but association with degradation. His allies must distance themselves or risk contamination. The Vikings had weaponized shame itself. They understood that in honor-based societies, reputation was more vital than life. Kill a man, and his sons might avenge him, destroy his masculinity while leaving him breathing. and his own community finishes the job. The traumatized crew became vectors of terror. They carried synchronized nightmares back to their villages. Their inability to protect their leader translated into collective masculine failure. Every man who heard their story wondered, could I have done better? Would I have fought? Would it have mattered? This is where it becomes truly systematic. The Vikings didn't need to assault every captive. They needed only strategic demonstrations. One broken chief could pacify entire regions. The threat became more powerful than execution. Execution had limits, but imagination multiplied horror infinitely. The technology evolved with practice. They learned which acts created maximum psychological damage, which positions triggered deepest shame, which audiences ensured widest dissemination of terror. This wasn't sadism. This was engineering. Consider the resources saved. Instead of garrisoning conquered territories, instead of maintaining occupying forces, the Vikings created self-enforcing subjugation. The victims' own communities became the enforcement mechanism. Social death required no Viking maintenance. But here's what reveals the true sophistication. They understood recovery was impossible within existing social structures. A maimed warrior might heal and fight again. A ransomed chief could rebuild power. But a sexually degraded leader? The very social system that created his authority now demanded his destruction. The Vikings had discovered vulnerability, encoded in masculine social architecture. The same structures that elevated male dominance contained instructions for their own demolition. They'd found the destroy command hidden in patriarchal programming. The forced witnesses were crucial. Solo victimization might be hidden, denied, reframed. But collective witness created undeniable social fact. 20 warriors who saw their chief destroyed couldn't collectively forget, couldn't synchronize lies, couldn't maintain useful denial. Each witness became a walking reminder. Every time these men gathered, their shared trauma surfaced. They couldn't rebuild warrior solidarity because the foundation, their chief's inviolable masculinity, had been publicly shattered. The warband dissolved not through death but through shared knowledge. These broken chieftains became something worse than dead. They became living proof that Viking raiders had perfected a weapon that could destroy entire cultures without swinging a single axe. The Old Norse language had 7 different words for calling a man sexually passive, but not a single word for love between men. Think about what that means. An entire vocabulary engineered for destruction, but silence where affection might exist. This wasn't linguistic accident. This was architectural design. The Vikings had built shame into the very structure of their language. Let's count them. Argr, the unmanned. Ragr, the cowardly passive. Sorðinn, the sexually used. Sorðinn, the penetrated. Sorðinn, the demonstrably penetrated. Brotharbani, brother killer, which somehow also meant sexually passive. Ruthless, the anally passive. Every word was a weapon, crafted for maximum damage. Each term carried slightly different implications, different levels of insult, different legal consequences. The precision reveals obsession. Why develop such elaborate vocabulary for something supposedly abhorrent? Why create linguistic scalpels for dissecting masculine failure? The answer lies in function. These weren't just insults. They were legal triggers, social weapons, control mechanisms. Each word opened different pathways to destruction. Some mandated combat, others enabled property seizure. All guaranteed social demolition. But here's what the silence revealed about Viking priorities. Search Old Norse texts for words expressing love between men. Affection, tenderness, romantic attachment. The vacuum is deafening. The language literally couldn't express what it systematically destroyed. You could call a man 7 different variations of sexually passive, but you couldn't say you loved him. This linguistic architecture shaped thought itself. Without words for positive male intimacy, such connections became literally unthinkable. The vocabulary channeled all male relationships through competition, dominance, carefully maintained distance. The construction was deliberate. When you can only speak destruction, you can only think destruction. When every word for male intimacy carries death, intimacy itself becomes lethal. The language programmed its speakers for isolation. The language literally made certain thoughts unthinkable. Consider how this worked in practice. 2 men who felt affection had no words to express it safely. Every available term carried implications of feminization, penetration, social death. The closest they could come was silence, and silence could be interpreted as hiding something worse. The elaboration of shameful vocabulary served another function. It created hierarchies of degradation. Being called arg was bad. Being called sorðinn, demonstrably penetrated, was worse. The gradations allowed for precise social positioning, careful calibration of insult. But the vocabulary went beyond direct terms. The language developed elaborate metaphors, all pointing toward the same obsession. Agricultural terms about ploughing, animal terms about mounting, craft terms about hammering. Every field of life provided new ways to articulate the same fundamental terror. The poetry was worst. Skilled skalds competed to create ever more elaborate ways to imply sexual passivity. Kennings, poetic circumlocutions, allowed for artistic destruction. You could destroy a man's reputation in verse so beautiful, it would be repeated for generations. Here's where it gets revealing. The same culture that created elaborate praise poems for warriors, complex genealogies for heroes, nuanced descriptions of courage, maintained deliberate poverty in the language of male affection. The contrast exposes priorities. The silence spoke volumes. In a culture that named everything, every type of wind, every shade of horse, every variety of sword, the absence of words for male love was deafening. This wasn't oversight, this was engineering. Watch how the vocabulary shaped behavior. Without words for healthy male intimacy, all closeness became suspect. Men maintained careful distance, performed elaborate heterosexuality, avoided any gesture that might be misinterpreted. The language created its own behavioral prison. The foreign influence is telling. When Old Norse needed to express Christian concepts of sin, it borrowed Latin terms. But for sexual shaming, they had abundant native vocabulary. The linguistic richness reveals cultural obsession predating Christian influence. Translation became weapon. When Christians arrived, they found ready-made vocabulary for their own obsessions. Argr became sodomite with barely a shift in meaning. The machinery of shame translated perfectly across religious boundaries. But here's the crucial point. Vocabulary shapes reality. By creating elaborate language for degradation while maintaining silence around affection, Vikings engineered a culture where male intimacy could only be conceived as dominance or submission, never as mutual care. The poets understood this power. They were the engineers of reputation, the architects of shame. A skilled skald could destroy a man more thoroughly than any warrior. Words outlived wounds. Verses persisted past death. Language became the ultimate weapon. The Vikings had weaponized their own language, but they'd also revealed their greatest fear, one that would echo through their women's unexpected freedoms. While men died for touching each other, the Viking wife ran her fingers through her female concubine's hair without anyone batting an eye. The contrast was absolute. The same society that created elaborate machinery to destroy men for suspected femininity barely noticed when women shared beds, exchanged caresses, expressed physical affection. The silence around female same-sex relations was as total as the obsession with male ones. This wasn't tolerance, it was invisibility. Viking law codes that meticulously detailed every variation of male sexual transgression contained nothing about women with women. The sagas that destroyed men through implication ignored obvious female relationships. The poetry that weaponized male sexuality treated female intimacy as beneath notice. The same act that killed men was Tuesday afternoon for women. Why? The answer reveals everything about Viking sexual control systems. Women's sexuality didn't threaten the foundation of social order because women weren't part of that foundation. They couldn't hold political power, couldn't own substantial property, couldn't lead war bands. Their sexuality was irrelevant to power structures. A man accused of sexual passivity lost his legal standing, his property rights, his social existence. But women already lack these things. You can't strip status from those who never had it. You can't threaten masculine privilege in those denied masculinity itself. But this freedom came with a dark price. The invisibility was double-edged. Women could express physical affection because that affection was deemed meaningless. They could share intimacy because their intimacy didn't matter. The same patriarchal structure that policed men so brutally ignored women so completely that their desires became irrelevant. Consider the household dynamics. A wealthy Viking man might have a wife and several concubines. If those women sought comfort with each other, emotional, physical, sexual, it threatened nothing. The man's masculinity remained intact, his property rights unchallenged, his social position secure. The sagas occasionally mention these relationships in passing: a queen who loved her handmaiden above all others, warriors' wives who found solace together during long raids. The language is matter of fact, without judgment or condemnation, because without threat to masculine power, there was nothing to condemn. But here's where it gets revealing. This selective blindness exposed the true purpose of Viking sexual policing. It was never about the acts themselves. It was about power, hierarchy, the maintenance of masculine dominance. Women's sexuality was unpoliced because it was unpolitical. The tolerance revealed something terrifying about what Vikings really protected. They weren't protecting sexual morality. They weren't maintaining natural order. They were protecting the specific configuration of power that made men dominant. Any male sexual variants threatened that dominance. Female variants, existing outside power structures, threatened nothing. This created strange freedoms within oppression. Viking women could express same-sex affection, seek female comfort, build intimate female relationships, as long as they didn't challenge male authority. Their emotional lives belonged to them precisely because Vikings considered those lives worthless. The legal codes make this explicit through absence. Hundreds of laws about male sexuality, nothing about female. The law concerned itself with what mattered: male reputation, male property, male power. Women's relationships with each other fell outside legal concern. But watch how this shaped female survival strategies. In a world where men might kill each other over accusations of femininity, women created networks of mutual support, invisible to male violence. They built emotional structures men couldn't police, because men couldn't conceive them as threatening. The concubine system reveals the paradox starkly. A man might keep multiple women for his sexual use. If those women turned to each other for emotional or physical comfort, it was expected. The alternative, jealousy, competition, isolation, MSO, would disrupt household peace. Female intimacy served patriarchal stability. Christian observers later noted this with confusion. They arrived expecting to condemn all same-sex activity, but found Viking men obsessed with policing each other, while women openly shared affection. The missionaries had to create new categories of sin to address what Vikings had systematically ignored. The archaeological evidence supports this blindness. Grave goods, household arrangements, artistic representations, e.c., all suggest female relationships that historical texts ignore. Women buried together with interlocked hands, shared personal items between unrelated women, architectural spaces designed for female gathering. But the ultimate revelation is this: Viking men were so focused on destroying each other over masculine reputation that they created spaces where women could experience what men couldn't: uncomplicated same-sex affection. The price was invisibility, irrelevance, exclusion from power. But within those constraints, a different world existed. The double standard wasn't kindness. It was the purest expression of patriarchal logic. Police what threatens power, ignore what doesn't. Women's relationships with each other were free precisely because Vikings considered them meaningless. Women's bodies weren't policed because they weren't seen as capable of the kind of destruction Viking men feared most: the total annihilation of masculine identity that lurked in every male friendship. The man with the severed hand counted his silver compensation while behind him, another man was dragged away to die for words alone. Viking law had a price for everything. Cut off a man's thumb, 12 ounces of silver. Blind him in one eye, 24 ounces. Call him sexually passive. Your life or his. No other currency accepted. The legal mathematics revealed everything. Physical maiming had specific compensation rates, carefully calculated, precisely defined. But sexual insults existed in a different category entirely. They couldn't be bought off, paid away, compensated through wealth. They demanded blood. You could literally buy your way out of maiming someone, but here's how the system worked. Viking law was built on compensation, eifr, wergild, blood money, carefully negotiated payments that prevented feuds. Break a man's leg, pay the price, move on. The injured party could refuse compensation and demand violence, but social pressure encouraged accepting payment. But sexual accusations shattered this entire framework. There was no compensation rate for being called argr. No amount of silver could restore masculine reputation. The law removed monetary options, mandated combat, ensured destruction. Think about what this means. In Viking values, A functioning hand was worth less than an intact masculine reputation. Physical wholeness could be compensated. Social masculinity was beyond price. Argr, so far beyond that its loss required death. The legal code revealed what Vikings feared more than death itself. The distinction wasn't subtle. Laws spelled out exact compensation for every possible injury. Lost fingers, broken teeth, damaged organs, all had prices. But the moment sexual passivity entered the equation, the economic system collapsed. Money became meaningless. Only violence mattered. This created perverse incentives. Assault someone physically, face predictable financial consequences. Assault their masculinity verbally, face mortal combat. The law incentivized physical violence over verbal, break bones rather than speak words, maim rather than imply. But watch how this hierarchy functioned socially. A man who'd lost fingers in battle wore his maiming proudly. The compensation he'd received proved his injury's worth. But a man who'd faced sexual accusations, no amount of silver could make him whole. No payment could restore him. And this wasn't some obscure law, halal. It was the foundation of their entire system. The inequality was intentional. Physical injuries healed or didn't. Either way, they were finite. But reputation was eternal. A damaged body remained functional. A damaged masculinity ceased to exist socially. The law recognized this through its refusal to price what it considered priceless. Consider actual cases from the sagas. A farmer who accidentally castrated another man's bull paid 40 ounces of silver. A merchant who questioned another's manhood died in single combat. Animal fertility was worth 40 ounces. Human masculinity was worth everything. The system created its own logic. Why risk sexual insults when physical assault was safer legally? Why question masculinity when breaking bones carried predictable consequences? The law channeled violence into acceptable forms, physical, rather than social destruction. But here's where it gets complex. The same legal system that priced every physical injury refused to acknowledge sexual assault as compensable injury. A man subjected to sexual violence couldn't claim compensation. The act itself destroyed his legal standing to make claims. The violence erased the victim's ability to seek justice. This wasn't oversight. This was design. The law protected masculine reputation, not male bodies. It valued social position over physical integrity. A man could lose organs and remain legally whole, question his sexuality, and he ceased to exist as a legal person. The Christian conversion revealed this starkly. Missionaries struggled to understand why Vikings would accept compensation for extreme physical violence, but demand death for verbal insults. They were seeing different value systems. Christians focused on bodily harm, Vikings on social existence. The archaeology confirms these priorities. Weapons buried with warriors show extensive repair, evidence of bodies that sustained and survived massive physical trauma. But no saga celebrates survival of sexual accusation. Physical wounds created stories. Social wounds created silence. Medieval legal documents show the evolution. As Viking regions Christianized, sexual insults gradually acquired monetary penalties. But the transition was slow, contested. Communities clung to combat solutions generations after accepting compensation for physical violence. The persistence reveals deep programming. Vikings had built masculine reputation into the foundation of their legal system. Every other injury could be integrated into economic exchange. But masculinity itself remained outside commerce, beyond negotiation, worth more than flesh or silver. The Vikings had built a society where a broken bone healed, but a questioned masculinity meant annihilation, NETM, a priority system that would find its perfect successor in an unlikely source. His children were pulled away when he walked through the village, his wife wouldn't meet his eyes, and his voice, once commanding, now made people flinch. Social death in Viking society wasn't metaphor. It was a systematically enforced erasure that transformed living men into ghosts that happened to breathe. The machinery of exclusion was precise, collective, inescapable. The process began immediately. The moment accusation became fact, through combat loss, acceptance, or overwhelming witness, the social machinery activated. Every relationship, every interaction, every basic human connection was severed or transformed. He was breathing, walking, talking, but everyone treated him like a ghost. First came the legal death. The man lost his right to speak at assemblies. His testimony became worthless in disputes. He couldn't own significant property, make binding contracts, or seek legal redress for wrongs. The law erased him from civic existence. But legal erasure was just the beginning. The social mechanics were crueler. Former friends crossed streets to avoid meeting. Business partners dissolved agreements. Neighbors who'd shared meals for decades suddenly found urgent tasks whenever he approached. The physical choreography of avoidance was elaborate. Watch a socially dead man enter a market. Conversations halt mid-word. Bodies angle away. Children are quietly redirected. A bubble of empty space forms and moves with him through the crowd. His own brother had to publicly disown him or face the same fate. Family faced impossible choices. Association with the socially dead was contagious. Support him and share his fate. His wife could leave without shame. Lech, marriage to a non-person wasn't binding. His children could be claimed by maternal relatives. His brothers had to publicly denounce or face suspicion themselves. The cruelest mechanism was the corruption of memory. Stories were retold with him erased. Victories he'd contributed to were reattributed. Friendships were retroactively denied. The community collaborated in rewriting history to exclude him even from the past. But the cruelest part was what happened at the next harvest. Social death meant exclusion from collective labor. Viking society depended on cooperation, HAA, barn raising, harvest gathering, ship repair. The socially dead couldn't participate. Their labor was refused. Their presence at communal work poisoned the effort. This created economic death spiral. Without communal support, farms failed. Without social networks, trade became impossible. The socially dead often faced literal starvation amidst plenty, surrounded by food they couldn't access through social exchange. The religious dimension intensified isolation. The socially dead couldn't participate in sacrifices, seasonal festivals, communal rituals. They were barred from the very ceremonies that defined community membership. Gods themselves were understood to reject offerings from the dishonored. Even death offered no escape. The socially dead faced exclusion from proper burial rites. Their bodies might be disposed of in bogs, boundaries, liminal spaces. No memorial stones, no grave goods. No integration into ancestral landscapes. Erasure extended beyond death into eternity. The mechanics required collective enforcement. One person showing mercy could break the system. So the community policed itself, watched for signs of sympathy, punished compassion as complicity. Kindness became dangerous. Humanity became threat. Children were trained in the choreography of exclusion. They learned to recognize the socially dead, to perform avoidance, to understand association as contamination. The system reproduced itself through generations, encoding exclusion into cultural muscle memory. But here's what made it truly systematic: the gradient of social death. Not all faced total erasure. Some experienced partial death, univoquire, excluded from certain spaces but not others, denied some relationships but not all. The variability made the threat more potent. You never knew how far you'd fall. The partially dead became enforcers. Desperate to avoid further descent, they performed exclusion most vigorously. They policed boundaries they barely remained within. Their precarious position made them perfect instruments of system maintenance. Communication itself became weapon. The socially dead could speak, but who would listen? They could explain, but explanations from non-persons carried no weight. They could proclaim innocence into silence that swallowed words without echo. The physical markers accumulated. Denied grooming assistance, appearance deteriorated, excluded from communal meals, bodies showed deprivation. Barred from collective warmth, they bore marks of exposure. Visual difference reinforced social distance. Seasonal cycles amplified suffering. Winter meant death without communal wood-sharing. Summer meant failed harvests without collective labor. Spring meant no seed sharing for planting. Fall meant no participation in preservation that enabled survival. The sophistication was breathtaking. Vikings had created systematic exclusion that required no guards, no walls, no physical enforcement beyond collective will. The prison was everywhere and nowhere. The guards were everyone and no one. The Vikings had perfected something worse than execution, a living death that turned victims into weapons against their own communities, an innovation that Christian converts would soon perfect. The priest's Latin rang through the monastery. Sodomita. Different language, different god, exact same destruction. Christianity arrived in Viking lands, promising salvation, but delivered amplification. The new religion didn't dismantle the machinery of sexual policing, de-upgraded it. Where Vikings had earthly consequences, Christians added eternal damnation. Where Norse law ended at death, Christian law extended past it. The conversion revealed something crucial. The system for destroying men through sexual accusation was too useful to abandon. It just needed new vocabulary, fresh justification, divine backing. The Vikings had built the engine. Christians simply changed the fuel. Christians claimed to bring salvation, but they brought something else. Watch the transformation. Argr became sodomite. The concept translated perfectly. The accusation still destroyed. Combat was replaced by confession, but the outcome remained social death. The machinery hummed along, barely missing a beat. But Christians innovated where Vikings had been limited. Norse consequences were earthly: loss of property, status, life. Christian consequences were eternal: damnation, hellfire, separation from God forever. The stakes infinitely multiplied, while the basic structure remained intact. The new religion didn't liberate, it perfected the machinery. Here's what Christians recognized. Viking sexual policing already aligned with Christian obsessions. Both systems positioned male sexual passivity as ultimate transgression. Both created elaborate mechanisms for punishment. The theological framework was different, but the practical destruction was identical. Christian innovation came through universalization. Vikings had focused primarily on the passive partner, Christian, the penetrated, the feminized. Christians condemned both partners equally. The active participant, previously less stigmatized under Norse custom, now faced equal damnation. The net widened. The confession system created new horrors. Vikings demanded public combat, ID, violent but brief. Christians demanded detailed confession, IA, psychological torture extending indefinitely. Describe your sins. Enumerate your failures. Relive your shame before God and priest. The destruction became internal, endless. Now both partners were damned, closing the last loophole. Penance replaced combat but maintained destruction. Instead of dying in battle, the accused performed public humiliation, crawling on knees, wearing sackcloth, fasting unto starvation. The social death looked different but functioned identically: exclusion, shame, erasure. The written word amplified consequences. Viking accusations were oral, limited by memory and proximity. Christian records were permanent. Confessions were documented. Sins were archived. Your destruction was literalized in Latin, preserved for eternity. But here's where Christians truly innovated. They made the system self-enforcing through soul terror. Vikings required external accusation. Christians internalized the machinery. Your own conscience became accuser. Every thought, every glance, every involuntary response became potential damnation. The vocabulary expanded precisely. Where Old Norse had 7 words for sexual passivity, Church Latin developed dozens. Canonical texts elaborated categories, degrees, variations of sin. The taxonomy of destruction became a theological science. Monasteries became laboratories for perfecting the system. Men sworn to celibacy, living in close quarters, terrified of their own bodies. Every natural response became sin. Every human feeling required confession. The machinery of shame found its perfect testing ground. The visual culture changed but maintained focus. Vikings carved accusations into wood, temporary insults. Christians carved warnings into stone, eternal reminders. Church facades displayed sodomites tortured in hell. The message permanence increased exponentially. Legal fusion created hybrid horrors. Christian law layered onto Viking custom. Ecclesiastical courts handled soul crimes, while secular courts maintained blood justice. The accused faced double jeopardy, earthly punishment and eternal damnation. The systems reinforced each other. But the crucial innovation was making women equally subject to sexual policing. Viking invisibility of female relationships ended. Christians discovered female sodomy, created categories for women's sins, extended the machinery to encompass all bodies. The loophole closed. Conversion narratives revealed priorities. Sagas celebrating Vikings, accepting Christ, focused on sexual reform. Former raiders proved Christian virtue by policing sexuality more vigorously. The religion changed. The obsession intensified. The enforcement mechanisms evolved. Viking accusations required public forums. Christian surveillance penetrated private spaces. Confession made every Christian an informant on themselves. The panopticon was built from conscience. Here's the darkest innovation: forgiveness that didn't forgive. Christianity promised redemption while maintaining destruction. You could be absolved, yet remain marked. Forgiven, yet excluded. Saved, yet suspected. The double bind perfected psychological torture. The architecture reflected priorities. Viking halls were built for public accusation. Christian churches created confessional spaces, intimate architectures of shame. The destruction became private, personal, infinitely repeatable. Christianity had taken the Viking system and made it eternal. No longer could death end the shame. Now it followed you into the afterlife itself. Every conversation between men became a careful dance. One wrong gesture, one misinterpreted glance, and the legal machinery would grind them to dust. Viking men developed elaborate codes for navigating their world's sexual minefield. These weren't written rules but embodied knowledge, passed through example, learned through observation of who survived and who didn't. The choreography of masculine safety became second nature, performed without thought. Physical spacing was critical. Too close suggested intimacy, too far implied fear. Men calculated distances, maintained specific angles, ensured witnesses to every interaction. The geometry of conversation became survival mathematics. Men developed elaborate rituals just to have a conversation. Watch two Viking men meet. The approach was oblique, never direct. Eyes focused past each other, acknowledging presence without lingering contact. Weapons visible, prominently displayed. The sword says what the mouth cannot. I am dangerous, therefore not feminine. Greetings were formulaic, ritualized. References to violence, to women, to masculine achievements. Every conversation began with establishing credentials of manhood. The weather was discussed through warfare metaphors, trade through competition language. Even friendship required violent framing. The buddy system was essential but dangerous. Men needed allies but couldn't appear too close. The solution was triangulation, CHS. Always interact in groups of 3 or more. 2 men alone suggested intimacy. 3 maintained safe social dynamics. The safest strategy was to never be alone with another man. Public spaces provided protection through visibility. Private meetings invited suspicion. Business was conducted in markets. Negotiations happened in mead halls. Important conversations required audiences, witnesses to masculine performance, insurance against accusation. Alcohol created specific dangers. Drunkenness loosened control, revealed affection, enabled accusations. Men developed drinking protocols. We've not 5. Never match cups directly. Maintain weapon readiness. Perform aggressive masculinity more vigorously, as intoxication increased. Gift-giving required careful navigation. Too generous suggested affection. Too stingy implied fear. Gifts were framed as competition, dominance, obligation, never care. The language around exchange eliminated emotional content, transformed generosity into aggression, but some took incredible risks for moments of genuine connection. Physical contact was codified precisely. Warriors could embrace after battle, one violence, sanctified touch. Fathers could touch sons until specific ages. Brothers had limited allowances. All contact required justification, context, witnesses. Casual affection was lethal luxury. Travel created unique challenges. Ships, with enforced proximity, developed elaborate protocols. Sleeping arrangements, watch rotations, work assignments, all structured to minimize dangerous intimacy. The confined space became hyper-regulated masculine theater. Emotional expression found coded outlets. Grief for dead companions was acceptable, I think. The dead couldn't reciprocate dangerous affection. Poetry allowed emotional content if sufficiently violent in framing. Sagas celebrated friendship through descriptions of shared violence, never shared tenderness. Age provided certain freedoms. Elderly men, past warrior prime, faced less scrutiny. Their masculinity, proven through survival, was less questioned. Some found late-life companionship impossible in youth, but age brought its own vulnerabilities. Physical weakness reawakened feminine associations. Class affected navigation strategies. Wealthy men had more resources for maintaining distance, separate halls, numerous witnesses, elaborate households, preventing isolation. Poor men, forced into closer quarters, faced greater risks. Economic vulnerability meant sexual vulnerability. Seasons shaped behavior. Winter's confined quarters increased danger. Summer's movement provided escape. Spring celebrations required heightened performance. Autumn harvests demanded collective labor while maintaining individual boundaries. The calendar became coded survival guide. Foreign travel offered temporary reprieve. Away from home communities, some men found different possibilities, but return meant resuming performance. Stories of foreign lands contained warnings. Men who went soft abroad, forgot Viking ways, faced destruction upon return. The marriage imperative wasn't about desire but defense. Wives provided sexual alibi, social proof, masculine credentials. Children demonstrated virility. Failed marriages suggested failed masculinity. The pressure to perform heterosexuality was survival pressure. Occupations carried different risks. Warriors maintained masculinity through violence. Farmers through physical labor. Craftsmen faced suspicion. Delicate work suggested feminine qualities. Poets walked dangerous lines. Wordcraft was women's magic, but skalds held power. Religious roles provided complex navigation. Pagan priests performed feminine rituals while maintaining masculine authority. The contradiction required careful management. Christian conversion offered new frameworks, but maintained old dangers. The constant vigilance was exhausting. Every interaction calculated, every friendship dangerous, every moment of genuine feeling potentially lethal. Men lived in perpetual performance, unable to rest, relax, relate without risk. The system had turned every man into his own prison guard, but this self-policing would become the template for a control mechanism that would outlive Vikings, Christians, and entire civilizations. The same accusation that triggered axes in Viking halls and whips in monasteries now triggers fists in schoolyards. The weapons change, the wound remains. The machine the Vikings built has outlived their gods, their language, their civilization. It adapted, evolved, shed its skin like a serpent, but the core mechanism endures. The technology for destroying men through sexual anxiety has proven more durable than any empire. Trace the evolution. Viking argr became Christian, sodomite became Victorian, invert became modern slurs. The vocabulary mutates, but the function remains constant. Words that trigger masculine panic, demand violent response, enforce behavioral boundaries through terror. The words changed with each century, but listen to the fear beneath. The legal framework evolved but maintained structure. Viking combat became Christian, penance became criminal, prosecution became social ostracism. The enforcement mechanisms shifted from axes to authorities to anonymous harassment. The destruction adapted to available technologies. Watch how each era thought it was progressing while perfecting the same machinery. Enlightenment thinkers medicalized what Vikings had criminalized. Klet is not bida, creating diagnosis where there had been accusation. The destruction became scientific, wrapped in psychiatric vocabulary, but the outcome remained social death. The Industrial Revolution democratized the technology. Where Viking accusations required public forums, industrial cities enabled anonymous destruction. Urban density created new surveillance methods. The panopticon expanded from village to metropolis. Every generation thought they'd left it behind. But modern variations seem different but operate identically. Playground taunts that trigger violence. Locker room policing of masculinity. Online harassment campaigns. The same mechanism, weaponized masculine anxiety, functions through whatever medium each era provides. The persistence reveals the machine's elegance. It requires no central authority, no explicit laws, no formal enforcement. It runs on fear alone. Each generation of men teaches the next to police themselves, passing trauma disguised as tradition. Schools became training grounds. Boys learn early that certain accusations demand violent response. They don't know they're reenacting Viking law. They think they're just surviving childhood. The machinery reproduces itself through playground dynamics. The machine had become so perfect it no longer needed laws. Legal liberation didn't dismantle the mechanism. Decriminalization removed formal penalties while social destruction continued. Men could no longer be legally prosecuted but could still be socially executed. The machinery simply shifted from courthouse to culture. Corporate environments developed sanitized versions. Not axes but exclusion from networks. Not combat but career destruction. The glass ceiling has a twin, the lavender ceiling, professional death for those who trigger masculine anxiety in colleagues. Military institutions perfected the Viking template. Intense male bonding required for unit cohesion. Simultaneous terror of that bonding crossing undefined lines. The contradiction creates pressure cookers of masculine performance, ancient patterns in modern uniforms. Sports culture maintains the tradition most purely. Physical combat sublimated into competition. Team bonding that must never become affection. Locker room policing that echoes Mead Hall dynamics. Vikings would recognize every element. Digital platforms amplified the machinery's reach. One accusation can now destroy globally, instantly, permanently. The internet archives shame eternally. Digital footprints make erasure impossible. The technology evolved to match available tools. But here's the revelation. The machine persists because it works. Not for human flourishing, but for social control. Isolated men are easier to govern. Fearful men don't form threatening bonds. The machinery serves power by atomizing those who might resist collectively. Each era's rulers discovered the same tool. Vikings maintained warrior hierarchies. Christians enforced religious authority. Industrialists prevented worker solidarity. Modern systems maintain consumer isolation. The application changes, the mechanism endures. The international spread reveals universal application. Cultures with no Viking contact independently developed similar mechanisms. The technology appears wherever masculine dominance requires protection through male isolation. The pattern transcends specific origins. Mental health statistics document the damage. Male suicide rates, addiction patterns, emotional isolation, touch starvation. The machinery's victims fill therapists' offices, describing symptoms of ancient wounds in modern vocabulary. Resistance movements reveal the mechanism through opposition. Every push for male emotional freedom triggers violent backlash. The machinery defends itself through those it imprisons. Victims become enforcers, protecting their own cages. The cycle continues. Boys watching screens learn what boys watching Vikings learned, that masculinity means isolation, that intimacy threatens identity, that safety requires distance. Different medium, same message, eternal wound. Which brings us back to that longship deck, where a chieftain is about to discover that the Vikings had built something that would outlive their gods, their culture, and their civilization itself. The sun was setting as they finally untied him from the longship deck. 23 warriors stood in the same positions they'd held for hours, frozen by what they'd witnessed. Their chief, who'd led them through a dozen raids, who'd stood first in every shield wall, had been systematically unmanned while they watched. But now we understand what was really happening on that deck. This wasn't random brutality. This was the deployment of a weapon more sophisticated than any sword, more lasting than any wound. The Vikings had discovered how to weaponize masculinity against itself, creating a technology of control that would outlive their civilization by 1,000 years. The chief would live. That was the point. He'd return to his village carrying invisible wounds that would never heal. His wife would leave him, not from cruelty, but from social necessity. His sons would disown him to preserve their own futures. His warriors would disperse, unable to follow a leader touched by such shame. Every person he met would know. The synchronized trauma of 23 witnesses ensured the story's spread. No exaggeration needed. The truth was devastating enough. He'd become a living advertisement for Viking power, NET, not through his death, but through his continued existence as a social ghost. The ripples would spread. Neighboring villages would hear. Allied chieftains would reconsider resistance. The technology was efficient. One man's destruction could pacify entire regions. Why fight when defeat meant not death, but something worse? But the Vikings had built something larger than they understood. They thought they were creating a tool for conquest. They'd actually engineered a self-perpetuating machine for human isolation that would survive their gods, outlive their language, adapt to any culture that adopted it. Watch how it evolved. The same chief, subjected to ritual humiliation on a Viking deck, would have been labeled sodomite by Christian accusers centuries later, would have been diagnosed as deviant by Victorian doctors, would be destroyed through social media campaigns today. The methods change. The machine endures. The brilliance was in making victims into enforcers. Every man who survived such destruction became invested in the system that destroyed him. Better to police others than risk further fall. The machine recruited its own guards from those it imprisoned. That longship deck was a laboratory where Vikings perfected technologies we still live with. The careful positioning of witnesses, we call it public shaming now. The ritualized nature, you've bureaucratized it. The return of the living victim, you've digitized it. Every element persists in translated form. The 23 warriors who watched would never be the same. They'd seen their chief, embodiment of masculine power, reduced to nothing. The lesson was clear. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. They'd police themselves and each other with new vigor, terrified of suffering the same fate. Some would have nightmares. Others would become hypervigilant, performing exaggerated masculinity to ward off suspicion. A few might have felt sympathy, but could never express it. The witnessed trauma would ripple through their lives, affecting every relationship, every interaction. The chief himself faced a kind of death that death would have been mercy beside. He'd walk through his own hall as a stranger, sit in his own chair as a ghost, speak with a voice no one would hear. The Vikings had discovered how to kill someone while leaving them breathing. But they'd also revealed the system's weakness. Any mechanism based on fear contains its own destruction. The very intensity required to maintain such control eventually exhausts those enforcing it. The machine runs on human misery. Eventually, humans seek alternatives. Yet here we are, a millennium later, still living in the machine's shadow. Different words, same wounds. Different enforcers, same enforcement. The Vikings built so well that their invention outlived everything else about their culture. The lesson from that longship deck echoes across centuries. The most effective prisons are those we build in each other's minds. The most lasting conquests are those that make the conquered police themselves. The deepest wounds are those that turn human connection into threat. The sun has set completely now. The longship disappears into darkness. But the machine the Vikings built on its deck runs still, grinding through generations, powered by the inexhaustible fuel of human fear about what it means to be a man. The chieftain stumbles toward shore, forever changed. Behind him, 23 men stand silent, knowing they've witnessed something that will haunt not just their dreams, but their children's children's dreams. The machine claims another victim. The cycle continues. The wound endures.